The first time Tamsin Vale saw the runt, she was carrying a tray of cold mutton scraps down the servants' passage that ran behind the Osandrian throne hall, and the whole corridor was full of laughter. It wasn't kind laughter. 3 of the court handlers were standing around a hatchling pen sunk into an alcove off the marble hall, a place meant for envoys' dragons to rest between audiences, floored in warm sand and screened with gauze curtains so the nobility wouldn't have to smell anything unpleasant. Inside the pen, pressed into the corner, as far from the handlers as the walls allowed, was a dragon no bigger than a hunting dog, white from nose to tail tip, with pink-rimmed eyes that flinched from the torchlight. "Pallas," one of the handlers was saying, in the sing-song voice people use for something they've decided isn't worth taking seriously. "Poor little Pallas. Hatched wrong. The sky-tide envoy's going to take one look and leave him behind like spoiled cargo." "Better than leaving him behind," said another. "Better he never hatched at all. A white one. Bad luck on the wing, my grandmother used to say." The hatchling didn't make a sound. He just watched them with those raw pink eyes, small enough that his whole body trembled with each breath, and didn't try to argue his own case, because animals never do. Tamsin had worked the palace lunchroom for 6 years, carrying trays, scraping plates, elbow deep in dishwater most days, and she'd learned early that a kitchen worker's job was to be invisible in rooms like this one. She set the tray down anyway, on the little stone shelf outside the pen, and crouched so she was closer to the sand than to the handlers' faces. "He's listening to you," she said. "You know that. Dragons hear everything." The lead handler, a broad man named Osset, who'd never once learned Tamsin's name in 6 years, snorted. "He's a runt, girl. Doesn't matter what he hears. He won't be here past the week." They left, still laughing, and the gauze curtains swung shut behind them, like a door closing on an argument nobody had bothered to have. Tamsin came back that evening with the good cuts, the venison meant for the head steward's own table, the kind of meat kitchen workers weren't supposed to touch, let alone give away. She told herself she'd replace it from her own wages if anyone noticed. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed the lunchroom worker. The hatchling, Pallas, if that ugly little nickname was even his real name, wouldn't come near the meat at first. He watched her from the corner for the better part of an hour, while she sat cross-legged in the sand, and said nothing in particular, just the ordinary things she might have said to anyone, that the kitchen had run out of good paprika again, that her feet ached, that the marble floors of this palace were beautiful and freezing, and she'd never once been allowed to stand on them barefoot. He came to the meat eventually. He ate like something that hadn't trusted a full meal in a long time, in fast, anxious bites, glancing up between each one to make sure she hadn't moved. "There," she said. "See, nothing bad happened." She kept coming. Not every night. Some nights the lunchroom ran until the last bell and her legs gave out before her shift did. But most. She learned that Pallas liked to be talked to rather than touched, that he startled at sudden movement near his left side but not his right, that when he finally did let her rest a hand on his flank, his scales were warm in a way that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with just being alive. She learned, too, that the whiteness of him wasn't sickness, whatever the handlers said. It was simply what he was, the way some people are tall and some are not, and it embarrassed her a little that it had taken her 3 weeks of sitting in cold sand to understand something so plain. The court, meanwhile, had already decided what he was. A flaw, a bad hatch, something to be quietly moved along before the sky-tide envoy arrived and had the chance to be offended by Osandria's poor breeding stock. The envoy came on a gray morning, and it was not what anyone in the palace had prepared for. Tamsin heard about it secondhand, from the under-steward who came pounding into the lunchroom white in the face, saying the throne hall doors had opened on their own before the guards could reach them, and that something enormous had folded itself down through the archway, with a sound like a ship's sail catching wind. By the time Tamsin abandoned her post, against every rule she'd ever followed in 6 years, and pushed her way to the edge of the hall, the crowd had gone dead silent. A dragon stood beneath the vaulted ceiling, that Tamsin would have called ancient if she hadn't immediately understood, from the way every handler in the room had dropped to a knee, that the word for it was something closer to sacred. Her scales held the color of old ivory gone soft with age, veined faintly at the wingtips with a white so pale it was nearly translucent. The same white, Tamsin realized with a lurch in her chest, as the hatchling curled in the alcove pen not 30 feet away. "I was told," the ancient dragon said, in a voice that didn't need to be loud to fill the hall, that Osandria was sheltering a child of the old Aphelion line. I have come a very long way to find out if that was true. Osset, to his credit, tried to speak. What came out was mostly air. The Aphelion line does not hatch often, the dragon went on, turning her head toward the alcove as though she'd known exactly where to look before she ever entered the room. Once in 3 generations, perhaps less, white from the shell, marked so that no matter how far one of us wanders, no matter how distant the point our lives carry us to, there is always a way to find our way back to each other. She paused. You called him a bad hatch. You very nearly gave away the rarest child my people have seen in 100 years. The gauze curtain over the alcove pulled back on its own, pushed, Tamsin saw a moment later, by Pallas himself, small and white and no longer trembling, walking out into the open hall as if he'd simply been waiting for someone to finally ask him to. There was a great deal of ceremony after that, titles exchanged, apologies stammered through by men who would spend years pretending this morning had gone differently, but Tamsin remembered very little of it. What she remembered was the ancient dragon lowering her enormous head until it was level with Tamsin's, and looking at her, the way you look at someone you already know something important about. You fed him, the dragon said. It wasn't a question. Someone had to. Most wouldn't have. Most look at what a thing is not, and stop looking before they see what it is. The old dragon's breath was warm and smelled faintly of salt, of somewhere very far from Osandria's marble halls. He will remember this kitchen for the rest of his life. Longer than he remembers this morning, I'd wager. Pallas pressed his small head against Tamsin's side, once, the way he used to when the sand was cold and the handlers had just left. Then he turned and followed the ancient dragon toward the doors, because that was where he belonged now, and Tamsin understood that some good things are for a season, and not forever, and that this didn't make them any less good. She went back to the lunchroom that afternoon. Nobody had covered her shift. The dishwater was cold, and the head steward's venison was still missing from the ledger, and nothing about her life had changed in any way the palace records would ever show. But that evening, when she went to check the alcove out of habit, she found a single pale scale resting in the sand, where the pen used to be, small, warm to the touch even hours later, exactly the size of something a child might leave behind on purpose, for someone he intended to find his way back to.